The ocean offers peace, but beneath the surface lurks ancient power. Sharks strike without warning, turning quiet moments into chaos. These are true stories, bloody, sudden, unforgettable. Swimmers, divers, and sailors caught in life-or-death struggles with nature's most feared predator. From a beachside ambush to a deep-sea rescue gone wrong, these 6 shark encounters changed lives forever. Elizaveta Liza Morozova was no stranger to risk. At 29, she had already built a sizable following as a travel vlogger, known for her striking visuals and adrenaline-filled content. She had filmed everything from volcanic hikes to wingsuit flights, but nothing had prepared her for the raw, unpredictable force of what waited beneath the waters off Gansbaai, South Africa. On July 10, 2025, drawn by the promise of face-to-face encounters with great white sharks, Liza booked a cage diving tour, intent on capturing footage that would set her next video apart. Her GoPro was mounted snugly on her wrist, her wetsuit zipped tightly and her confidence unwavering. The boat rocked gently in the swell as the crew prepared the cage. A group of tourists chatted nervously, but Liza remained focused, mentally rehearsing camera angles and the pacing of her future edit. She had filmed dives before, but this time she wanted intimacy, movement, proximity, raw tension. That's why, as the others hesitated, she volunteered to go down first. Once the cage was lowered and secured beside the boat, she descended into the cold green water, bubbles trailing behind her. Almost immediately, the ocean around her darkened slightly. A shadow passed beneath the cage, wide and fast. Then another. One of the crew above tossed a large bait line into the water, drawing the attention of the sharks nearby. Liza braced herself and raised her arm with the camera, aiming for a sweeping shot of the murky surroundings. Moments later, a massive 15-foot great white appeared from below, gliding toward the cage with eerie calm. Its eyes were black, unreadable, and its jaws slightly parted. Liza steadied her breathing and adjusted the camera angle. The shark made a wide pass, then turned back sharply. It began circling the cage, each pass closer than the last. Its movements were no longer graceful. They had become tight, twitchy, deliberate. The cage rattled slightly as the animal brushed against it. Liza stayed still, hand gripping the sidebar, camera still pointing outward. Without warning, the great white charged. Its snout slammed against the lower left side of the cage with shocking force. Bubbles exploded upward. Steel bars groaned. Liza felt the entire cage shudder. Something popped beneath her, metal grinding on metal. A weld seam, weakened with time or pressure, split open just enough. Before she could pull her arm back, the shark found the gap. Its snout forced through first, teeth bared. Lisa's right arm, still holding the GoPro, had drifted too close to the opening. The shark's jaws snapped shut around it. She was yanked violently forward, her shoulder slamming against the cage bars. A cloud of blood bloomed instantly in the water. Her body twisted, her legs flailing as she tried to brace herself. The pressure on her arm was immense, hot, grinding, and sharp. Above, the crew shouted and scrambled to raise the cage. The crank groaned as it began to lift. Inside, Liza was still pinned, her body being pulled against the bars while the shark thrashed wildly outside the gap. It jerked its head left and right, tearing muscle and tendon. Her scream, muffled by the regulator in her mouth, was lost in the surge of bubbles and churning blood. As the cage rose foot by foot, the shark's grip shifted. It didn't let go so much as it re-angled, gnawing and twisting. Liza felt her bones crack, her fingers crush inward, and her elbows separate with a sickening pop. She gripped the bars with her free hand, trying to hold herself back, trying to keep from being pulled further through the breach. Her vision blurred, a mix of pain and the murky water clouded with her blood. Then finally, the shark released her. Its snout slipped back out through the gap as it rolled away, the scent of blood trailing in its wake. Her arm dangled uselessly, torn and lifeless, flesh stripped and bone exposed. She collapsed to the floor of the cage, cradling the limb with her remaining strength, her mouthpiece barely staying in place as she gasped for breath. By the time the cage broke the surface, Liza had already begun to lose consciousness. The crew pulled her out, shouting for towels, pressure, something to stop the bleeding. Her wetsuit was soaked in red. One of the crew held her arm up and recoiled. It was barely connected. The GoPro was gone. A helicopter arrived within 15 minutes. She was airlifted to a hospital in Cape Town, where surgeons worked for hours to save what they could. But the damage was far too extensive. The arm had to be amputated just below the shoulder. Infection risk was high. She woke days later, her body drained, her face pale, her right side aching with the weight of absence. News of the incident spread fast. Footage taken from the boat captured the moment the shark hit the cage and the pool of blood that followed. The viral headlines came next. Debates about cage safety reignited, with experts pointing to structural fatigue, poor maintenance, and the growing commercialization of wildlife encounters. Others questioned the ethics of baiting predators for tourist entertainment. Liza spoke little at first. Her team managed her accounts, releasing a short statement thanking the crew for saving her life. She didn't post videos for months. When she did return, it wasn't with shark clips or ocean vistas. It was a quiet video filmed in her apartment, her empty sleeve pinned to her side, her voice calm but solemn. She described what happened in short, careful words. She didn't blame the shark, and she didn't sensationalize the pain. She spoke of silence underwater, of helplessness, and of knowing something ancient and powerful had reminded her what it truly meant to be fragile. The video struck a chord. It wasn't just a tale of survival, it was a reckoning. She had gone to the ocean seeking adrenaline, but had come face to face with something far more humbling. And though her arm was gone, she remained. A reminder that nature doesn't negotiate and awe often walks beside danger. And beneath the waves off Gansby, the great whites still swam. Emma Calder had spent most of her adult life capturing the wild world through her camera lens, and she had always believed that the line between observer and participant should be respected. But sometimes, in quiet moments, that line blurred. On April 18, 2019, after a long day photographing turtles nesting along the red-tinged shores near Broome, Western Australia, Emma walked barefoot down to the surf as the sun dipped low over the Indian Ocean. She was 33, solitary by nature, and accustomed to working in remote places where calm and beauty met danger. Her gear was packed in the car. Her skin still carried the heat of the day. She waded in, ignoring the warning signs planted along the dunes, signs that cautioned against swimming at dusk. A warm current brushed against her legs as she moved deeper, pushing out past the shallow breakers. The tide was slack. The wind had dropped, and the sea was calm, unusually so. She floated on her back for a while, staring up at the sky streaked with orange and gold. She had no way of knowing that days earlier, local fishermen had dumped offal and fish remains just north of that stretch, and the smell had drifted with the current. Tiger sharks, drawn by the scent in the presence of migrating turtles, had been sighted cruising the coast. Most had moved on, but one stayed behind. From the beach, 2 tourists were walking along the shore when they paused to watch Emma's silhouette out in the water. They noticed how still she was, drifting farther out than most would at that hour. Then one of them pointed. Just beyond her, a dark fin rose. At first, they hesitated, unsure if it was a dolphin, but the movement was wrong. It moved straight, without breaking the surface much, and then dipped again. A second later, the calm was broken by a sharp splash. Emma jerked forward in the water, vanishing beneath the surface in a violent swirl. The shark hit her from below. It came fast, biting deep into her left thigh and abdomen with its massive jaws, serrated teeth tearing through flesh and bone. The impact drove her downward, and water rushed into her lungs as she was pulled under. She kicked instinctively, but the power of the shark's body overwhelmed her. The blood that surged from the wounds clouded the water around them instantly. The tiger shark circled tightly, releasing her for only a moment before biting again, this time crushing her hip and dragging her deeper. Back on shore, the tourists screamed and ran for help. Lifeguards, just finishing their shift, sprinted from the nearby watch station, grabbing boards and radios as they raced to the water. They paddled hard, but by the time they reached the area where Emma had vanished, the sea was red and silent. There was no sign of her at first, only the slick trail and a floating sandal. Then one of them saw her, floating face down, arms spread wide, her body drifting just beneath the surface. They pulled her onto the board and turned her over. Her torso had been torn open and one leg was nearly gone. There was no pulse. Her face was pale, eyes still open, mouth full of water. CPR began anyway. They worked desperately as more help arrived. Paramedics came running from the car park, kneeling beside her on the sand, trying to restart a heart that had already surrendered. After long, silent minutes, the call was made. Emma Calder was pronounced dead on the beach as the last light of day faded behind the waves. News of the attack spread quickly. It was the first fatal shark attack in the region in years, and the fact that it had happened so close to a populated beach shocked the community. People who had grown used to swimming at dusk, who had ignored warnings year after year, suddenly re-evaluated the risks. Locals gathered at the shoreline the following morning, laying flowers where the lifeguards had pulled Emma from the water. Marine authorities identified the species responsible based on the bite radius and wounds. A tiger shark, estimated to be at least 13 feet long. They believed it had been patrolling the coastline, feeding on turtle carcasses and the remains of fish. The warm conditions and late hour had created the perfect storm. Emma had entered the water at the wrong place, at the wrong time. Debate reignited immediately. Conservationists warned against calls for culling, insisting that humans shared the ocean with apex predators. However, others pushed for immediate safety measures, expanded nets, increased patrols, and stricter enforcement of no-swim zones at dusk. Tour operators canceled dives that week, and signs warning of shark activity were updated across the coastline. Emma's family, devastated but composed, released a short statement. They spoke of her passion for wildlife, her respect for the ocean, and her belief in understanding nature rather than fearing it. She had spent her life capturing wild moments from behind a lens, but in the end, the wild caught her. Her friends described her as quiet and thoughtful, with a deep reverence for animals and landscapes. She had traveled across continents, but always returned to the sea when she needed peace. Her final photos, recovered from her camera, showed a nesting turtle crawling toward the surf, untouched and ancient, unaware of the danger that lurked offshore. The beach near Broome remained closed for several days. Helicopters searched the waters but were unable to find the shark again. Experts knew they rarely lingered. The predator would move on, disappearing back into the vastness of the Indian Ocean, leaving only silence and a torn piece of the shore's memory behind. And still, the ocean rolled on, beautiful, warm, and wild. Chelsea Ramirez had built her online presence on a blend of beauty, confidence, and daring tropical adventures. At 22, she had already become a recognizable name among travel influencers, with millions of followers eager for her beachside glamour and underwater stunts. When she arrived in the Bahamas in May 2025, she was determined to film content that would keep her trending. Compass Cay, known for its crystal-clear waters and famously tame nurse sharks, seemed perfect. Videos of tourists swimming and even hugging the sharks had been circulating for years, and Chelsea saw an opportunity to go viral with something even more eye-catching. That morning, she stepped off the tour boat in a bright bikini, surrounded by fellow influencers and a guide who had briefed them on shark etiquette. No sudden movements, no chasing, and never touching their faces. Nurse sharks were docile, he explained, but they were still wild animals. Strong, fast when provoked, and equipped with thousands of tiny teeth designed for crushing and suction. Chelsea nodded but had her own ideas. She was live on multiple platforms, speaking to her followers as she slipped into the warm water. The sharks moved slowly through the shallows, their brown, smooth bodies gliding past her legs. The other tourists kept their distance, reaching out occasionally to gently touch a fin. Chelsea, however, had instructed a friend to film underwater as she swam closer to one of the largest sharks hovering near the edge of the group. She adjusted her mask, pushed her hair back, and floated down to the shark's level. The plan was simple. Get close, press her lips near the side of its head, and hold the pose for 3 seconds. Just enough for a viral freeze frame. She had seen others try similar tricks. No one had gotten hurt, or so it seemed. But Chelsea misjudged how close she could get. As she leaned in, her face brushed directly against the shark's eye and mouth region. The contact was sudden. The nurse shark reacted instantly. With a violent jerk, it twisted upward and clamped down on the left side of her face. The pressure was immediate and shocking. The shark's jaws, though small compared to more aggressive species, were lined with rows of sharp, sandpaper-like teeth. Its powerful suction drew skin and muscle inward. Chelsea thrashed instinctively, her arms flailing as the water around her filled with red. The shark held for only seconds, but it was enough. Blood streamed from her cheek and temple as she surfaced, screaming, water cascading from her face as she pulled off her mask. Chaos erupted on the dock. Tourists scrambled to get out of the water. Guides rushed to her side, pulling her to the platform as she held her face, shaking, gasping for air, and crying in pain. Deep gashes ran along her cheekbone just below her left eye, and the wound bled heavily. Bits of torn skin and blood floated in the shallows, and the nurse shark had already retreated into deeper water, spooked and gone. Chelsea collapsed onto the dock, trembling as towels were pressed to her face. She had trouble seeing through the blood and salt water stinging her eyes. A local medic was already on the radio, calling for a medevac to Nassau. Her friend, still holding the camera, dropped it in shock as the reality set in. The stunt had gone wrong. Within an hour, Chelsea was airlifted to a hospital where doctors began cleaning and assessing the damage. The shark's bite had torn through her cheek and near the corner of her mouth. While no bones were broken, nerves had been exposed and several muscle layers had been ripped. She underwent emergency surgery to close the wounds and minimize scarring, though surgeons warned that recovery would be slow and might not fully restore her facial symmetry. Her social media accounts went dark for several days. Behind closed doors, Chelsea battled the fear that her face, her brand, might never look the same. But after initial recovery, she posted a tearful, unfiltered video from her hospital room. Her face was swollen and stitched, her voice raw. She explained what had happened, accepted full responsibility, and pleaded with her followers never to treat wild animals as props. The reaction was immediate. Some mocked, others sympathized, but many praised her honesty and vulnerability. The incident went viral, covered by news outlets around the world. While the injury wasn't fatal, the images were disturbing enough to spark renewed discussions about influencer culture, risk-taking for clout, and the growing lack of respect for wild environments. Marine biologists weighed in, reminding the public that nurse sharks, though often seen as passive, were still capable predators with powerful bite forces. It wasn't about aggression, it was about boundaries. Tour operators at Compass Cay began reviewing their safety briefings, posting larger warning signs, and reducing the number of tourists allowed in the water at one time. Several guides admitted that they had long feared something like this would happen, but the pressure from social media had created an atmosphere where everyone wanted a more thrilling shot than the last. Chelsea eventually returned to the public eye, though her content shifted. She posted more cautiously and began speaking about conservation and wildlife education. The scar on her cheek became a permanent reminder of that moment. A souvenir not just of pain, but of recklessness. She often said later that the ocean didn't punish her. It reminded her that it was not a stage, not a background for curated perfection, but a living force that could turn in an instant. And beneath the turquoise waters of Compass Cay, the nurse shark still swam, slow and silent, waiting only to be left alone. Willem van Dijk had always found peace on the water. At 38, the Dutch-born expat had been living in South Africa for nearly a decade, settling in Plettenberg Bay, where the ocean was part of daily life. An experienced kayaker and seasoned swimmer, he made a habit of rising before the sun and gliding across the calm surface just as the world woke. He relished the solitude, the stillness, and the long horizon stretching beyond the cliffs. That Wednesday morning, February 12, 2020, was one of those perfect days. The sea was smooth like glass, barely touched by wind. The sky carried the pale glow of dawn, and the swell was gentle, barely enough to rock the narrow fiberglass hull of his ocean kayak. Willem wore a red life vest and carried a dry bag with water and a snack tucked behind his seat. His paddle sliced cleanly through the water as he moved farther from shore, about 300 meters out, where the shallows gave way to deeper blue. Behind him, several other kayakers trailed in the distance. They were part of a small local group that often launched together, though Willem preferred to move ahead, seeking quiet. Just before 6:30, he slowed, letting the water carry him, savoring the rhythm of the ocean. It was the kind of moment he lived for. No sound but the lapping of water. No movement but the occasional seabird cutting across the sky. But beneath that peaceful surface, something stirred. Unseen far below, a massive great white shark patrolled the edge of the drop-off where baitfish gathered in the early light. Driven by instinct and drawn upward by the profile of a narrow, elongated shape gliding across the surface, the predator mistook Willem's kayak for a seal or dolphin. It accelerated without hesitation. What happened next occurred in seconds. A thunderous splash shattered the calm as the shark launched upward, breaching from the depths with extraordinary force. Its jaws struck the underside of the kayak, splitting it nearly in half. The hull cracked like a brittle shell, and Willem was catapulted violently into the air before crashing into the water. His paddle flew one way, the shattered remains of the kayak the other. The impact sent shockwaves across the surface, and startled shouts echoed from the other kayakers now turning toward the disturbance. One of them, a man paddling 50 meters behind, later recalled seeing a tail fin rise out of the water, long and thick, followed by a swirl of foam and red. For a moment, there was only chaos, a flurry of splashes, the creak of torn fiberglass, and Willem's body floating in the white churn. The shark bit once, its massive jaws clamping onto his torso, crushing ribs and tearing deep into his side. Then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. The others began shouting for help as they paddled furiously toward the wreckage. By the time they reached the spot, the sea had grown still again. Only pieces of the kayak remained, shards of fiberglass bobbing in a widening slick. Willem's life vest floated a few meters away, torn at the straps. A rescue call was sent immediately, and within minutes, boats from the nearby station were speeding to the scene. The coastline, once calm, now filled with sirens and the distant hum of engines. The rescue team scanned the water, pulling in debris, hoping to find something, anything. But Willem was gone. Divers were dispatched to search beneath the surface while drones scoured the area from above. All that remained were fragments of the kayak, his paddle, and blood still dispersing into the sea. By midday, the search was called off. Officials confirmed what the paddlers already knew. Willem van Dijk had been killed in a shark attack. The bite radius and the condition of the kayak confirmed the species. A great white shark, likely over 4 meters in length. It had struck from below, mistaking the kayak for prey in the dim morning light. The single bite had been enough to inflict catastrophic injuries. News of the attack sent shockwaves through the local community. Though South Africa had long been known for its great white population, attacks on kayakers were rare, and fatal ones even rarer. It had been more than a decade since the last fatal incident in the area. The tragedy made international headlines, particularly in the Netherlands, where Willem's family grieved from afar. Tributes poured in from friends, fellow paddlers, and conservationists who knew him not just as an athlete but as a quiet, thoughtful man with deep respect for the ocean. Locals gathered on the beach the next morning, many of them kayakers who had paddled the same waters countless times. Flowers were laid along the shoreline. A paddle, painted white and marked with Willem's name, was planted in the sand pointing seaward. Conversations shifted from grief to questions about detection systems, safety measures, and whether technology could ever predict or prevent such swift, natural violence. Marine biologists weighed in, emphasizing the shark's behavior as instinctual rather than aggressive. Sunrise and sunset hours were known to be particularly risky, especially for solo paddlers. The silhouette of a narrow kayak moving across the water closely resembled prey from below. Some called for mandatory use of shark deterrent devices. Others argued that the ocean would always carry risk, and those who ventured into it needed to accept the terms. Willem's family later released a brief statement. They spoke of his love for nature, his years spent kayaking across the world's waters, and his reverence for the sea. They asked that no blame be placed on the animal, only that his death serve as a reminder of the ocean's raw, untamable power. In the weeks that followed, changes came slowly. Local authorities began exploring sonar-based shark detection systems along popular kayaking routes. Signs were updated with clearer warnings about peak risk times, but many who lived by the sea knew that these steps could only do so much. The line between beauty and danger in the ocean had always been thin. Willem had known it and accepted it. His name was etched onto a brass plaque later affixed to a coastal trail that overlooked the bay, where sunrise lit the water just as it had that morning. For those who continued to paddle those waters, Willem's story became a silent companion, a reminder gliding just beneath the surface. And out beyond the breakers, the sea moved on, vast, wild, and unchanged. Manuel Torres had spent most of his life at sea. At 54, the seasoned Portuguese fisherman knew the waters off Peniche better than he knew the streets of his village. He had fished these coasts since he was a teenager, through storms, droughts, and long, lean years. On the morning of June 21, 2024, with the summer sun climbing fast and the Atlantic unusually calm, Manuel loaded up his 18-foot skiff and set out alone as he had countless times before. His boat was old but sturdy, built of fiberglass and wood, fitted with a single outboard motor and a radio unit mounted to the side of the center console. Coolers sat ready for a good haul. Buckets of bait lined the stern and a few small bloodstains marked where he'd cleaned fish earlier that week. The tide was right, and the swell low, ideal for fishing mackerel and sea bass along the outer shoals. Manuel had no reason to think that this day would be any different. By early afternoon, the sun beat down and sweat soaked through his shirt. He had already caught enough to make the trip worthwhile, and a few drops of fish blood had trickled from the cleaned catch across the deck. Manuel sat back eating a sandwich, letting the boat drift with the engine idling low. The water around him was dark and still, glinting under the bright sky. Then, with no warning, something massive struck the underside of the boat. The jolt was so sudden it knocked Manuel forward. His sandwich dropped to the floor as he grabbed for the side of the console. A deep, hollow thud echoed through the hull. For a second, he thought he'd run aground or snag something, but the depth was too great. As he leaned over to look, the boat shook again, harder this time. From the starboard side, a large shadow moved beneath the surface, and a moment later, a dark dorsal fin broke the water. It was unmistakable. Wide, powerful, and serrated at the top. A great white shark. Not small either. At least 4.5 meters long, easily the size of his boat. It circled slowly, just beneath the surface, then vanished again. Manuel stood frozen, trying to remember if he'd spilled more blood than he thought. The deck smelled strong of fish, and he now realized that the small leaks from his cleaning bucket had trickled overboard for hours. Then came the third strike. The entire boat lifted slightly as the shark rammed it again from below. The cracking sound was sharp and immediate. Fiberglass splintered near the stern, and Manuel stumbled backward. Water began to seep in through a long crack near the rear of the hull. He scrambled toward the motor, hands shaking as he reached for the ignition. As he turned the key, the shark breached halfway out of the water, jaws open, and struck the starboard gunwale with such force that Manuel was thrown sideways into the console. His head hit the ground hard and everything went white. He dropped to the floor, pain blooming across his arm as he landed awkwardly on it. Something snapped. He rolled over, dizzy and gasping, his vision swimming. The shark thrashed beside the boat, sending a spray of water into the air. Blood from the deck mixed with the seawater sloshing underfoot. Water poured faster now through the widening crack. Manuel crawled to the radio, his broken arm clutched to his chest. He fumbled with the dials, blinking blood from his eye. Static buzzed, then a voice cut through. He gave his location with a shaking voice, barely managing to get the words out before the radio went silent again. Another slam to the hull forced him to grab hold of the side rail with his good hand. The skiff groaned as the fiberglass tore open farther. The stern sagged lower. The shark circled once more, slower this time, before vanishing into the deep. Manuel didn't know if it would return or not. He didn't wait to find out. With the boat sinking fast and his legs slipping on the wet deck, he grabbed the nearest floating object, his largest cooler, and threw it overboard. He clutched it tight and plunged into the water, grimacing as the salt stung the cut on his forehead. His broken arm ached with every movement. He kicked away from the boat just as the stern dipped below the surface. The skiff groaned and bubbled as it went down, drawn under in seconds. Now alone, surrounded by open sea, Manuel clung to the floating cooler, eyes wide, searching the water for any sign of the shark. The minutes dragged. Every ripple sent a jolt of fear through him. His legs hung motionless below, his broken arm resting across the lid of the cooler, his breath shallow. It took nearly 25 minutes for the rescue boat to reach him. When the orange vessel finally appeared on the horizon, Manuel didn't have the strength to call out, but they spotted the cooler and the shape of a man clinging to it, barely upright. Hands reached down and pulled him aboard. His face was pale, his shirt soaked in blood, and his right arm dangled uselessly at his side. He was shaking violently, lips blue, but conscious. Medics treated his injuries as the boat raced back toward the harbor. His arm was broken in 2 places, and he'd suffered a concussion from the blow to the head. The gash on his forehead required stitches. He was lucky to be alive. News of the attack spread quickly through the fishing community and beyond. Photos of the shattered boat fragments pulled from the water, along with Manuel's bloodied life vest, were broadcast across Portuguese media. Marine experts confirmed it was a great white, likely attracted by the blood and fish remains. Though great whites were not unknown in Iberian waters, this level of aggression was rare. Attacks on boats, especially of this nature, were virtually unheard of in the region. The incident sparked a fresh debate about altering shark behavior in Atlantic waters near Portugal. Warmer ocean temperatures and shifting fish migration patterns were thought to be drawing large predators farther north and closer to shore. Marine authorities began urging solo fishermen to avoid bleeding fish on deck, to clean their catch only once ashore, and to carry emergency deterrents or backup radios. Manuel recovered slowly. His broken arm was set in a cast, and for weeks afterward he refused to go near the water. He later told reporters that it hadn't felt like an accident, that the shark had attacked with purpose, targeting the boat and following through with each strike. The memory of the massive jaws and the sound of the hull splitting haunted his sleep for months. Eventually he returned to the docks, though never alone. Friends accompanied him now, and his new boat, slightly larger and equipped with reinforced hull plating and sonar, was named Esperanza, meaning hope. And off the coast of Peniche, where the waters run deep and the horizon stretches wide, the sharks still patrol, silent, ancient, and always watching. Marco Bellini had always trusted the sea. At 41, the seasoned Italian sailor had crossed the Mediterranean more times than he could count, and after years of coastal voyages, he longed for longer, more solitary routes. In early March 2017, he set out to cross the Red Sea alone, steering his trimaran along a course that would take him from Port Ghalib, Egypt, toward the coast of Eritrea, skimming 60 kilometers off Sudan's arid shoreline. The trip had been smooth until a sudden squall struck without warning in the night. The wind came fast and vicious, tearing at the sails and capsizing his vessel before he had time to correct course. Waves broke over the deck as the trimaran twisted violently, one pontoon breaking loose. Within minutes, Marco was thrown clear, his harness dragging behind him. Soaked and disoriented, he surfaced beside the overturned hull, gasping for breath, the storm already fading into eerie calm. The boat was unsalvageable. One hull was fully submerged, the other cracked. Using what little strength he had left, Marco deployed the small orange life raft strapped to the deck and pulled himself aboard. The night air was cool and the sky above glittered with stars, a cruel contrast to the helplessness below. He was alone, 60 kilometers from land, his trimaran drifting with him. His satellite beacon had been damaged in the flip, but he still had a flare, a knife, and an emergency beacon clipped to his vest, its battery low but still functional. He waited in silence, rocking in the soft swell, watching the horizon, feeling his heartbeat echo inside his ears. Hours passed. He had little water, no food, and could hear only the whisper of the waves against the rubber walls of the raft. Just before dawn, the sea grew darker beneath him, not from clouds, but from movement. They came slowly at first, shadows moving below, just outside visibility. Marco recognized the behavior immediately. Oceanic white-tip sharks. He had read stories, survivors of wrecks who spoke of them as constant companions. Curious, persistent, opportunistic. Unlike other sharks, they didn't vanish after a pass. They lingered. As the sun crested over the horizon, Marco saw the fins break the surface. 3 sharks at first, then 5. Long, sleek bodies, their white-tipped pectoral fins glowing in the sunlight. They moved with eerie patience, circling wide, closing the gap inch by inch. Occasionally, one would dart in and brush the underside of the raft, testing it. For hours, Marco remained still. He kept his legs crossed, hands inside the raft, heart pounding at every bump. But then one shark grew bolder. It nudged the raft again, harder this time, pressing its snout against the rubber, tearing slightly at a seam. The hiss of escaping air made Marco jolt upright. He grabbed the paddle resting beside him and reached to shove the shark away. The moment his arm extended over the edge, the shark struck. It lunged from the side, jaws open, and clamped down on Marco's forearm. The force of the bite drove his arm down into the water, pain erupting instantly. He screamed as teeth tore through muscle and tendon, the shark shaking once before letting go. Blood surged into the sea, bright against the blue. The other sharks, sensing it, moved closer. Marco collapsed backward into the raft, clutching his arm. Blood pulsed through the torn limb, dripping onto the raft floor. His vision blurred as shock set in. Acting on instinct, he pulled the belt from his waist and wrapped it tightly above the wound, cinching it as high and hard as he could. He screamed again, but the bleeding slowed. Outside, the sharks bumped the raft again. Their movement changed. Less cautious now, more frantic. Marco knew he had to act. With shaking hands, he reached into the supply pouch and retrieved his emergency beacon. The light was dim but still pulsing. He activated it and lay back against the raft, pressing the beacon to his chest and closing his eyes, his good hand still gripping the belt to keep pressure on the wound. Time became loose. The pain blurred everything. The sharks continued circling, brushing the raft and tearing at its edges with more confidence. The raft deflated slowly, sinking lower in the water. The bleeding had slowed, but Marco was cold, pale, and weak. His lips cracked from thirst, his limbs trembling from exhaustion. He drifted in and out of awareness, each bump against the raft jarring him back to the surface of reality. Then, hours later, a new sound rose over the ocean, a low rumble. He opened his eyes to see the silhouette of a large ship approaching. A commercial freighter, flagged under Panama, responded to the faint signal of his beacon. A crewman on deck spotted the orange raft and shouted. Within minutes, a rescue boat was lowered into the water. By the time they reached him, Marco was barely conscious. His injured arm was wrapped in the belt, soaked in blood, his skin cold and gray. The raft was half submerged, and the crew noticed fins vanishing into the deep as they approached. The sharks had not left him in hours. He was lifted aboard, given water, and wrapped in blankets. The crew called for medical evacuation as the freighter turned toward Port Sudan. Doctors at a local hospital later said the bite had narrowly missed a major artery. His forearm was torn but salvageable. He had lost a dangerous amount of blood, suffered mild hypothermia, and was in shock, but he survived. Surgery followed. Months of therapy came after that. His arm never fully regained its strength, but his grip returned enough to sail again. Marco's story spread quickly, first among maritime circles, then through international news. His survival was called miraculous, though he never used that word himself. When asked what it felt like, He often said the ocean didn't try to kill him, it simply didn't care if he lived. The sharks to him were not evil. They were hungry, curious, just doing what they had always done. What made them frightening wasn't malice, but persistence. The incident brought renewed attention to oceanic whitetips, once among the most common pelagic sharks, but now increasingly rare and aggressive due to overfishing that has decimated their food sources. Conservationists used Marco's story to remind the world that the sea was changing and not always for the better. Marco never blamed the shark, but when he returned to the water, he made two changes. He never sailed without a backup beacon, and he never underestimated the patience of a predator that had survived millions of years without apology. And somewhere in the deep, where the surface glitters and wreckage drifts silently and slowly, the white tips still circle, watching, waiting, and never far behind.